The point of a liberal arts education is not how to learn how to make a living. It's how to learn how to make a life worth living. And I am forever grateful to him for nudging me in that direction, because what he said to me essentially was, you are worthy as a creative human being and you'll find your way.
Welcome to this week's As Unexpected podcast, when we talk to C-suite executives, entrepreneurs, and philanthropists about how they lead into the future when the future generally goes as unexpected. I'm Scott Marshall, your host, and my own professional experience has made me a believer that it's not how you show up when all goes as planned, but it is how you show up when things go as unplanned. Given all of their experiences, each of our guests has become very attuned to the fact that the future is not to be predicted. My hope is that this podcast can help all of you become better leaders by building the core leadership capabilities for leading in an uncertain world. Hey, everybody. Welcome to another episode of As Unexpected. Today, I have with me a good friend, someone who I admire greatly, who it's just a deep honor to have on this podcast. You're going to love his story. You're going to just deeply admire and appreciate his work. Skye Fitzgerald, welcome to the As Unexpected podcast.
Yeah, thanks for having me, Scott. Pleasure to be here.
Yeah. Skye, if you don't mind, would you give our listeners just a bit of background on your origin story, your work that led you to your current place, and some of the work you're currently engaged in?
Yeah, I actually went to college to study theater. I thought I was going to work in the theater, and that didn't happen. I stumbled into a television directing class in grad school and kind of never looked back, and just kind of fell in love with directing for the little rectangle. But because I didn't go to film school, I kind of had to teach myself everything myself. And so it very much approached it from sort of a blue collar standpoint. And, right out of grad school, I bought a camera and for a couple of years lived out of the trunk of my car, working as a sort of roving cameraman from contract to contract. And on the tail end of that 2 years, I got my first contract with Semester C to be the videographer at that time, is what it was, because it was an external contract at that point in Semester at C's history. And so I jumped on the Semester at Sea voyage, and sort of the world just opened up to me in new and exciting ways. And ultimately kind of cut my teeth as a camera person, filming that 3.5-month voyage. And then subsequently went back and did it again a year later, and was exposed to more culture and more countries and more languages and more things I hadn't seen or experienced. And I kind of became a devotee of exploring the world through cinema. And for me, that meant sort of trying to uncover those stories that we in the West may not otherwise have access to or understand.
That's brilliant. And we're going to try to overcome Skye's humility through this next 25 minutes because his work is quite extraordinary. He's not just a cameraman; he's a true storyteller, and so we're gonna dig into that and hopefully surface some of that.
All right,
Skye, I know the nature of the work you've done, and I imagine that we could spend hours talking about all the unexpected things that you faced on site in the places you've conducted your work. But it does one just pop in your head right away, like, this is a pretty amazing story, which I'm sure you have many. Things didn't go as planned, pretty unexpected, and you had to find a way to show up for yourself, for the team you had with me, for the people whose story you're telling.
Yeah, I think if you don't mind, I'd like to go further back than that, because I had some foundational experiences earlier, before I was really established as a filmmaker, that I think have influenced my work through the course of my career and sort of continue to shape how I work when I run into moments like that. And one of them in particular was extraordinarily profound for me in terms of how it changed me as a human being. And it actually happened in the States. So I lived in LA for about a year once upon a time, because I thought that, that's where you had to be if you're in the film industry. And I ended up not feeling like it's a place that I would be happy or productive in. But while I was there, I used to go to Santa Monica all the time and just ride my bike, north and south along that path they have outside Venice Beach in Santa Monica. And well, I did it one day, and I was just riding my way north on this path, and I rounded this turn, and I heard this enormous crash, like this just deafening smash. And as I finished coming around the curve, I came upon this car accident that had just happened, like literally seconds before. And it was a multi-car accident on the Pacific Coast Highway, which is parallel. And it involved 3 or 4 cars. And there was a Volvo that had somehow hit another car and then been launched into the air and hit the front end of a VW bus and sort of peeled the top of the VW bus back like a can opener, and then landed on the other side of it. And there was a dead person in the middle of the road. There was someone decapitated on the other side of the road. And on one of the cars, a woman had gone through the windshield, and she was lying on the hood of the car, through the smashed windshield, sort of semi-conscious. And she was sitting there moaning, covered in blood. And I took all this in just an instant. It just happened. The smoke was in the air. People were moaning. There were obvious multiple fatalities. And I knew exactly what I wanted to do. Like, I wanted to find some way, like, as a human being, to run over and help this woman because she was alive. And from my layman's perspective, she was obviously dying. Like, I didn't believe she was going to survive, but she was alive in that moment. And my instinct was, I need to run to her, and I need to give her whatever solace I can in this moment while she's suffering. And instead of doing that, I froze. I just froze. And I don't know if it was out of fear or lack of confidence at that point in my young life, but I did not do the thing that my sort of soul was asking me to do. And so I sat there for 15, 30 seconds, 45 seconds, doing nothing, absolutely nothing, when this woman was dying in front of me. And then the sirens began. And then you could hear the ambulance was on its way, and the police, and you knew they were going to be there within a minute. And indeed they were. But that moment has always been sort of seared into my memory as one of the great failures of my life. It's a moment I'm not proud of, because I knew she was dying, and I knew that I could have done something, even if it was as simple as like providing some measure of comfort to a dying woman, by grabbing her hand. And my failure to act in that moment really profoundly affected me. And I sort of made a promise to myself from that moment forward that in moments of indecision, that I would act. That I would act on instinct, and I wouldn't allow myself to be frozen by fear or indecision or lack of confidence. I would listen to that sort of inner voice and inner instinct, knowing what the right thing was to do, despite all external stimuli. And that really did profoundly affect me as a human being. And it's, I think, shaped how I operate and how I make films as well. Because I'm an active and engaged participant in the topics and the stories and with the people that I collaborate with in filming. So I think that's sort of foundational to all of my work.
Yeah, well, it seems like being there in that moment and then reflecting on it has impacted your work, but your life and who you are as a person deeply. And I would imagine 99% of humans would have also frozen.
Well, I don't know. Who knows, right?
I don't know, but
yeah,
what a
maybe,
moment.
maybe not.
Yeah.
I mean, I like to think that we are inherently good, right?
Yeah.
And that people would respond, but there's so many factors involved, right? And I was a young man, like I
Yeah.
didn't have a lot of life experience, and so, but I, I will say that I'm glad that happened to me. I'm glad that happened because it forced me to confront how I wanted to move through the world
Yeah.
in moments of crisis in particular.
Yeah.
So I think that relates back to your starting question here in
Yeah.
some abstract way, perhaps.
Yeah. At the core, what you're saying is, listen, at the gut level, at the most core of our humanity, we know what we should do.
Yeah.
We know
Yeah, absolutely.
when
Yep.
we're allow ourselves to access.
And to listen.
Yeah.
And to listen and to try to not let fear guide us, right? Because I think that's one of the great sadnesses of modern life for me, is that so much of us on this planet, I think, are driven by fear so much of the time. And that's kind of what that moment was for me, is it was deciding not to allow fear to drive me. Do you remember that old, there was I think it was a shoe company that their name was No Fear.
Yeah.
No Fear. I think it was a skateboarding company or something.
Right.
I always thought that should be KNOW. No Fear, right?
Yeah.
Because fear is this natural part of being human, right? It's part of our nervous system response to something that we think could harm us, right? But that doesn't mean that it's negative necessarily. I feel like what we should do with that is sort of acknowledge it, embrace it, and I think the real challenge as human beings is to know it and act anyway, right? To not allow it to deter us or freeze us, but to embrace the fact that this is frightening on some level, and I'm going to act anyway because I'm listening to that inner voice.
Yeah. Yeah. Love it. Love it. For those of you who don't know, Skye really has been recognized widely for his work. And I can tell you, I've watched a trilogy that he put together that was each of the films within the trilogy tell a different story, but they're all deeply humanitarian, deeply important. And I think in shooting those films, Skye, I'm guessing that there were moments where you used the lessons from that moment in Santa Monica to work through. Maybe you didn't have fear anymore, but there had to be moments that were uncertain, that you had to act, that you had to trust your gut, because they weren't expected, and you had to deal with those moments. Are there any you can share from the trilogy you shot?
Yeah, there's a lot of moments like that. I think one that was very concrete in my mind was when we were filming Lifeboat, which is about a rescue operation in the Mediterranean to try to save migrants and refugees who are crossing the Mediterranean from North Africa to Europe. And that's a context where, when you're on a rescue operation, the only way you can get on a boat like that, right, is by a full acknowledgement that first and foremost it's a rescue operation, that lives are at stake, that the stakes are life and death, and that if a moment occurs where someone's life is at stake, the filming will be secondary or even tertiary, right, to what needs to be done. Yeah. And that conversation happened with the captain and the head of mission before we stepped on the boat, right, and then all the way through. So as a storyteller, as a filmmaker, right, it's this interesting dynamic of honoring these people's stories at really tough moments in their life and building trust with them in relatively short duration. But then there's other moments where, like, we were at sea one day and there were literally thousands of asylum seekers in boats. And we were the only rescue vessel in the area. And so, we jumped on a Zodiac, an inflatable. And we were the first point of contact to many of these boats, going out and doing basically a welfare check with them. And one of these boats was this huge wooden boat that had 2 levels on it. And it probably, on that boat alone, there were probably, I would say 250 people. And it wasn't the length of that boat was not, it was maybe 15, 10 meters, maybe, it wasn't.
It was packed. It was packed.
Yeah,
tight.
exactly. It was stacked. It was sardines, human sardines. And so as we approached that boat, people are so desperate because they've been at sea that sometimes they jump into the water, right, to try to get on the Zodiac first. Sometimes they're pushed into the water. And we quickly found ourselves in a situation where there were multiple people in the water. None of them had life jackets yet, because one of the first things you do is you try to make sure everyone has a life jacket. And there were 2 people who were drowning. And we're filming this whole thing with GoPros, with handheld cameras. And so, suddenly as a storyteller, we're in this position where there's this incredible scene of human drama. And people are being pulled out of the water by crew members on the Zodiac. And then there's other people who can't swim, obviously, who are starting to go under. And, we had a decision in that moment. Do we film this entire scene because it's so dramatic? Or do we put our cameras down and reach into the water and grab that fellow human being and try to pull them into the raft? And there was no question in our mind, right? We were going to put our cameras down and reach into the water and grab that fellow human being. And, whether the film suffered from that or not, I don't know, but it was the only decision we could make as filmmakers, and then be able to sleep at night, frankly.
Yeah.
So those sorts of moments in the kind of work I do happen all the time. And often what it means is you have to be a human being first and a documentarian second. And I'm completely at peace with that. Not all sort of subgenres of my category of filmmaking agree with that approach. There is this cohort of thinking that you're always a fly in the wall and you never engage, right? But in some of the work that I do, I couldn't work that way, knowing that someone could have drowned right in front of me and I didn't put my hand out.
This episode of As Unexpected is sponsored in part by Semester at Sea, a study abroad program for college students and adults on career breaks, sabbaticals, or retired, interested in learning and exploring the world together. Learn more about the Lifelong Learner program at www.semesteratSea.org. Yeah. That's a profound example for sure. Can we go to your most recent film,
Sure.
Chasing Rue?
Yeah.
Which I've only been able to watch the trailer, and the trailer itself sets up a really interesting tension just on its own, just over a minute.
Yeah.
So I look forward to watching the whole thing because I'm totally pulled in. What happened there? First of all, what led you to that topic? And then there had to be something unexpected during that time.
Yeah.
Can you give us some insight?
Yeah. So Chasing Rue is about a couple things, a lot of things.
It's about a lot of things. Just the trailer says it's about a lot of things.
Yeah. So I'll go back to sort of the personal origin story for that, for me, because it's not obvious, but it's real. And that's that many years ago, maybe 15 years ago, I was shooting a State Department film in the DRC, the Democratic Republic of Congo. And we're on the outskirts of Goma, which is at the moment taken over by the M23 rebels. And they were sort of a fledgling group then, kind of working around the perimeter of the city. But they were at work even then. But we were filming this thing for the State Department, and we stumbled across an abattoir, a slaughterhouse. And in the course of like an hour, we witnessed this scene that for me at the time was just extraordinary on one level, horrific on another. So there was a line of cows outside of this abattoir, and we had complete access to this facility. And we watched, a gentleman with a bolt gun, which is a gun where a big steel plug comes out of, put it up against the side of a cow, right? Stun the cow falls over on its side. And then immediately they wrap with these big chains around the front legs of this cow, and the cow is winched into the facility and then winched up, hanging upside down, right? And and that's where he's going to meet his maker, right? And it's halal style, and so he slits the cow's throat, um, and while the cow is bleeding out, starts to butcher it, starts to decapitate it. All to say, in the course of about 15 minutes, we bore witness to a living animal being slaughtered and cut into about 15 pieces. Okay? And that was the main protein producing facility for the second largest city in DRC. And I at that moment, that was sort of the planting of a creative seed in me, where I knew that at some point in my career, I wanted to do a film about our relationship with animals, writ large, because it wasn't something I'd ever examined before. And as an animal lover, as the owner of 3 dogs, etc., I love animals, and yet I'd never really examined sort of that linkage between going to the supermarket and buying a package of sirloin, right? And because I hadn't had to bear witness to how that gets to that supermarket shelf, I'd never really deeply examined it. From that moment forward, I knew I wanted to. So fast forward 15 years, and I read this article. I think it was in Outside or Nat Geo, that the annual kangaroo cull in Australia was the largest commercial killing of a land-based wildlife in the world every year. And my antenna went up, and seed was watered a little bit, right? So I started doing research, and I learned that this cull, which was commercialized now, had been going on for generations, and I knew nothing about it. And as it turned out, it's you don't really hear about it because the communities who do it are very siloed. They're very protective of it, and it happens under cover of darkness in the deep outback. And so it just the word just doesn't get out a lot.
Sure.
Yeah. So I started researching it, and discovered very quickly that the communities really didn't want stories done because they'd gotten so much bad press about it. And the more I researched, and the more articles I read, and the more people I talked to, photographers and so forth, who had documented this, I was surprised that almost all of the coverage was negative, that sort of demonized these kangaroo hunters, right? And I knew it had to be more complicated than that, more complex than that, coming from a small rural community in Oregon where hunting was a lifestyle, where half of my class, high school class, disappeared every fall, to go deer and elk hunting. Because they need venison in the freezer, right? Like what I imagined was a fuller reality was that probably this was an economic engine that was very much needed in these small, economically downtrodden communities. And so I started building a relationship with one of these communities. Took about 18 months, and then after that, on the phone, almost exclusively, they sort of invited me in. And we flew to Australia and started filming it. And it was just me and my director of photography, 2 of us, in a motorhome for 5 weeks, going from location to location, shooting this thing. And that's how we did it. And, while I wanted to cover the kangaroo cull, we did that. We got into that pretty quick because we'd already built this relationship from afar. And a couple weeks in, as a storyteller, I just knew that if all we covered was this pretty heavy, dark, harvesting of kangaroos, which is pretty macabre, it's pretty graphic, it's these beloved icons of Australia being butchered essentially, for profit. I knew that if that's all the film was, that it would probably be unwatchable. And so I did a pivot, and we also started working with what's called a carer. in Australia, and a carer is a person who has a certification, and they're given like juvenile animals that have been abandoned, or their parents maybe have been killed or hit by a car, and then they raise the animals into adulthood. So we started working with a carer who dealt with juvenile and joeys, baby kangaroos, and also with this organization called Wires, which runs a wildlife ambulance. So they have the equivalent of an animal 911 line that you can call. And then if like a kangaroo is hit by a car, you call this number and they literally send out a wildlife ambulance to do a welfare check and sometimes bring it to a hospital to do surgery. So that's the tension that I wanted, because both realities we found were equally true and authentic. I didn't want to just do a story that demonized the hunters, for sure. I wanted to do a story that created empathy for the hunted as well as the hunters. So that was the intent.
Yeah. And everybody should know that this film, Chasing Rue, has been nominated or recognized by the Social Impact Movie Association.
Social Impact Movie Awards, yeah.
Awards, yes. And again, I have not had a chance to see it. I've watched the trailer. I'm definitely going to watch it because, as Skye, I think, was saying correctly. I mean, he is a master storyteller. He creates the right kind of tension. He tells human stories, and every one of his films I've watched have just been super impactful for me. This is a good pivot for us, Skye. I'd like to read a quote for you.
Okay, do it.
I shared it with you earlier, and as I shared with you when I was talking about the quote, I like to read the whole stanza because to me, it's the whole stanza that has the real meaning that Robert Frost was trying to communicate, not the oversimplification. So with it, I'm going to read it to you, and I'd love to get your thoughts.
Yeah.
I shall be telling this with a sigh, somewhere ages and ages hence. Two roads diverged in a wood, and I took the one less traveled by, and that has made all the difference.
Yeah, that's such a great poem. I love it. Well, so many ways I could respond to that, Scott. Poetry is such a catalyst, for thinking for me. One of the seminal books for me is a book that was given to me as a high school graduation present by my English high school teacher, and is the Prophet by Khalil Gibran. And so that's a book that I often sort of return to remind me of the wisdom on certain issues. I think if I can, I'd like to respond with a quote from Gibran, which off the top of my head is, "Work is love made visible." I think that's somewhere in the Prophet. I think it's in the Prophet, but that's one of those things that has always stuck with me, that has served as sort of a guiding light, is that the work that I do is my love, right? I craft it with love. It is the thing I love more than in the world. I don't know that I could do anything else. If there was a fork in the road for me from a career standpoint, other than turning from the theater into documentary in grad school, there was an earlier creative fork in the road for me when I was an undergrad. And that happened when I was in my last year of undergrad. And I started to, as a thespian at that time, become really concerned about how the hell do you make a living with an undergraduate degree in theater, right? And I wasn't particularly talented as an actor or anything else. So I was like, man, I don't know how this is going to go. And so I started to think maybe I should turn away from the arts, which was, my instinct was the arts. My instinct was I'm a storyteller in some form or fashion. I just didn't know how yet. And so as someone who tries to be pretty proactive in life, I said, well, what would be a career that, would have, enough income that I could see myself doing, that sort of, pulls into maybe some of the things I've learned as a thespian I can make a living at. And I thought, well, if you were a trial attorney, right, that there's some acting going on there. And I know that attorneys can make a lot of money. So
Sure.
what I did was I literally went to the library as a senior in college, and I just spent like an entire afternoon reading up about what attorneys do, because I thought maybe I need to go immediately from my undergrad, become an attorney. Then I know I can make a living and I won't be living under the bridge with a shopping cart, right?
Yeah.
And so I spent that entire afternoon reading up on what attorneys did, and it was pretty disillusioned by the end of that. Actually, I was like, wow, that's not really what I thought they would do. So there was this tension within me suddenly about, well, do I want to be a creative human being, or can I afford to be a creative human being, or do I need to take a practical path in life?
Yeah.
And so I took the next week, I went in and talked to one of my mentors. I was fortunate to have a couple mentors in college, and one was an English professor. And I told him about this internal struggle I was having. Like, I don't know if I can follow this creative path in life, whatever it is, because how do I pay rent? I don't come from, a place of generational wealth necessarily. And so how do I do this? And he said something to me which nudged me. And he said, the point of a liberal arts education is not how to learn how to make a living. It's how to learn how to make a life worth living.
Okay.
And I am forever grateful to him for nudging me in that direction, because what he said to me essentially was, you are worthy as a creative human being, and you'll find your way.
Yeah.
Right. And it's turned out to be true for me, where instead of going to law school, where I'm sure I would have made a lot more money than as a documentary filmmaker, I have been fortunate to have my work be really fulfilling. And to feel like I do create meaning through it, at least for myself.
Yeah. Love it. There's a lot of great stuff in there. And what I really hope is there's some young listeners, some young adults who take to heart what you've just shared, that you've learned from others, that you've embraced in your life. Work is bringing love to life. Is that what you... Visible.
Work
is making...
Work is love made visible, I think is the quote.
Work is...
that's Khalil Gibran.
Yeah, indeed. There's just such power in those few words. This has been awesome. Skye, thank you for the time.
Yeah.
I, again, have just great respect for the love that you've put into your work, and you've made visible for so many people. Good luck on your next projects.
Okay.
Have a safe flight to Nairobi.
Yeah.
And next time I'm in Portland, hopefully we can have that beer again.
Okay, great. Nice talking with you, Scott.
You too. Thanks, Skye.
Yep.
This episode of As Unexpected is sponsored in part by Semester at Sea, a study abroad program where students visit 10 countries on 3 continents, all while taking 3 to 4 college classes through Colorado State University. See course offerings and upcoming voyage itineraries at www.semesteratsea.org. Thank you for joining this week's episode of the As Unexpected podcast. The viewpoints and opinions of featured guests do not necessarily represent those of the Institute for Shipboard Education or Semester at Sea. Hit the like button, share it with your colleagues, family, and friends, and remember, be curious, be compassionate, be courageous. That's what it takes to lead as unexpected.